Hi, my name is Ashley Christensen, and this is my capstone project. I titled it Writing Through History. And so as we go forward, we're going to go ahead and see a historical timeline following through. So the question is that what is American literature? So this is the culture and history from different viewpoints of the United States throughout history that has showcased the downfalls and the triumphs of America. This can be shown through many different cultural aspects, racial integrations, and we'll follow through with some of those as we go through the different authors. American literature will help improve society by learning from the authors that have lived before. This is where some of the most famous American authors have come from. And when I say American, I titled that term loosely because some of these authors have immigrated from other countries to America, but they have adapted to the American ideology of life. So the first person we're going to go ahead and start with is Susie King Taylor. So Susie King Taylor was born in 1848 and she died in 1912. So who was she? So she was a black woman who lived through the Civil War and wrote her time as a slave and as a nurse in the Civil War in her novel Reminiscences of My Life in Camp with the 33rd United States Colored Troops, late 1st South Carolina Volunteers. So she spoke out against the injustice of her people and became a female advocate for a better life for the African American community. But something that needs to be said about Susie King Taylor is that she grew up in slavery. She actually lived with her grandmother, and she was sent to a secret colored school to be able to educate black children. So this was illegal at the time, and so Susie and her siblings would actually put their books in buckets, and this is why the term bucket school was coined. This was done so that the police wouldn't stop them as they were going through. And as I read this became a memoir. This is an autobiography, but it's more than just an autobiography. This is a memoir of her entire life. It showcases her time from slavery to going to school, to acquiring her thirst for knowledge, and then as she advanced in her learning, then it changed to the fact where she actually became a nurse and a teacher in the Civil War. And mind you, at this point in time, she's extremely young. She might be 12 to 14 years old at this point in time, and she's already seeing legs blown off and so much more. But she also goes through, and she also states that she has some happy moments in her life, such as reminiscing about Piggy, which is a pig that can actually march to the beat of the drums. And so, but as she goes, she's showcasing her feelings about slavery and how her people are treated. And she became one of the first black nurses, but she also became one of the first advocates for black freedom. And this is really amazing to read as it gives you an idea of her sense of culture, her sense of identity, and where she stands. And so I really liked this author, and I thought she had a really great reminiscing of where she stood from. So the next person we're going to talk about is Josiah Strong. Josiah Strong is the only author in this array of timeline historics that actually held a position of power because he was one of the white people. He was a preacher and a theologian, and he actually wrote a book called From Our Country. He believed that America could be saved and made prosperous by spreading Christianity within the United States, especially within the big cities. So a lot of people who read this book, myself included at first, thought that he was a white supremacist. But as you read through it and you look deeper into the text and in the context and the form, you're going to be seeing that he's not promoting that he's better than everyone else, although he comes from a standpoint where he believes he's superior. But he's saying that immigration should be canonized into a small bits, which I can understand because even today in our political forums, our border control is super lax in some regard. But he's also saying that Christianity can elevate anybody, and he's promoting and he's thinking with logical steps to how to promote to make our community, our America, better. And he is one of the only people within what we've read how to make literally logical steps while promoting Christianity. And he also says that Christianity is a big brotherhood, and that is how this should be elevated and this should be made strong, because he also says the Industrial Revolution has made great technological and agricultural advances for this community. And the next one we're going to talk about is the Indians Appropriations Act. So this act actually did not allow Native Americans to be considered a superior race. So Congress passed a law in 1871 that refused to see Native Americans as a superior power and would no longer create treaties with the Indians. The government took land and forced the natives out of their homes. They eventually had to stipulate the law so that the Native Americans could have government-sanctioned lands that could not be touched. These are called reservations. This is really interesting because Josiah Strong was literally saying that the minority races should be elevated with the spread of Christianity. And the government at this point in time is saying, no, you're not going to be considered a superior race at all. We're no longer going to be seeing you as a superior race. So the Indians, if you look more closely into the act later on, most of these Indians converted to Christianity. So it kind of stems from a different standpoint. And so this is a law that was created wholeheartedly just to downpress the Native Americans because there's no longer a treaty that can be made. And so the government actually have higher power and can do what they wish. Moving into that, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was a law passed in America in 1882 that prohibited the Chinese people from immigrating to America. This was done due to Americans complaining that the Chinese were stealing their jobs. This is because the immigrants would work in any condition and work for low wage, which was why they were so popular on the American railways. The Chinese would literally move to America for the idea of an American dream. The fact that they can get a better job, better wage, and they can escape from China's poverty at that point in time. And so this is something that's pretty amazing because it was a law that was passed due to the fact that it was just because they were afraid that Americans were stealing their job. They were considered cheap labor. And this was especially prevalent that they wouldn't allow Chinese women to immigrate. So, interesting. And then the next one we have right here is Plessy versus Ferguson. So this was a Supreme Court case that was in 1896. It became a landmark for the racial segregation when Homer Ferguson would not sit in the car for black people. This originally happened in 1892 and was not ruled in Ferguson's favor. This is when he appealed to the Supreme Court to get a different response. The Supreme Court ruled in Ferguson's favor as the law was colorblind and is deemed as unconstitutional. This is amazing. So, racial segregation was big during the 1900s because of the fact that it was due to the Jim Crow laws, and so the black race was seen as lesser. It was a minority group, and they did not have a lot of say. And so for the fact that the Supreme Court could rule it in Ferguson's favor, and they deemed that this law was unconstitutional because the law is supposed to be colorblind, that is something that has not happened since. And so this is a major historical landmark for the black people, and this showcase that maybe America is changing their viewpoints just a bit. So, as I said, this is what happens after. Ozawa versus the United States. In 1922, Toccoa Ozawa was denied citizenship of the United States despite living in America for 20 years. He tried to argue that the immigrants are considered free white people. The court ruled against him due to the fact that Japanese were not considered Caucasian, even though he's literally lived in America for 20 years. Because he is not one of the white races, he was considered a minority, and because of this, he was denied citizenship. To become a citizen, you have to go through a process today that you can actually get it, but you have to go through many hours of paperwork. And so this just made me understand how difficult it really was to gain citizenship if you were not born in the United States. And so, as I said before, this is Plessy versus Ferguson. That was a major landmark for the black people. And this is just as a thought process that maybe it was turning around. But Ozawa versus the United States showcased that maybe this wasn't the case. Americo Paderas. So he was born in 1915 and died in 1999. So he was actually born in Brownsburg, Texas. I'm actually a famous Mexican author known for his book George Washington Gomez, which is about a boy who tries to balance his culture with his Mexican heritage. So when I say his culture, I mean this book showcased the ideals of living in a white president culture. So this book was all about how a boy who lived technically in America, but was still considered part of the Mexican government, which is in Texas. But then it was taken over by America, so these people are still holding on to a bunch of different cultures and ideas about their own Mexican heritage. And so this boy, as the text, when you're reading the text, you're getting his frustration, his anger, and he doesn't understand how he should keep a hold of his Mexican heritage, who he is, but while still adapting to the white culture to go ahead and fit in so that he can gain his education. Unfortunately, he ended up becoming so upset and he was so confused that he ended up saying that he was going to just go ahead and drop his Mexican heritage and just adapt to the white culture because it was easier of the two options. And so that author truly showcased struggles of his own time. This is an informational text. This is a novel that was based on his experiences and then who's he interrupted and encountered in his life. And so this is just something that really makes you think about how the time period was, who Americo Paderas had to become to be able to fit into the white culture and to the white race. And then Carlos Bulosan. He was an immigrant from the Philippines, came to America at a young age, realized that immigrants were treated poorly, and became an activist that stood against the prejudice against non-white people. He wrote a novel called America's Not the Heart, which highlights some of his experience living in America. This is very much an informational text. This is not quite a big autobiography as it is in Taylor's time, but this was a short reel of his life that some of the stuff that he faced, such as he really couldn't find a job, and the jobs that he did find were considered really cheap and horrible conditions because, like the Chinese, he would literally do any job that was available to him at the time. But the living conditions that he had to suffer through and everything else was it just wasn't a good situation for any of the immigrants because they were considered still that lesser minority race. And so as we move on, we get to talk about James Baldwin. This is a man that shocked me. So he was born in 1924 and died in 1987. So this is a Black author who took a different approach in his works, especially in his two letters, The Fire Next Time. In the first letter, he wrote to his nephew, who's 14 at the time, and he's telling him about the ignorance of the white people, that he wanted him to forgive him for they don't have the understanding. They don't look deeper into the heart of the Black race, and they just literally pass them by. They don't even try to understand these ones. And he tells his nephew to forgive them instead of judging them and hating them. And so that is a completely new turn that I've read and I fell in love with because of this man who's faced so many things and seen so many injustices happen that he's going to be willing to say, hey, wait, just look deeper into this. Understand that they don't understand us. And so this is something that whenever the second letter that he wrote within that was his 14-year-old self. This is reminiscence of his time in Harlem. And he's seeing how the young boys that he grew up with were never going to surpass their fathers, and that they were following to the crimes because it was easier money. And then he's basically allowing himself to understand that this does not help what the white race thinks of us. That this is why they believe that we have the prejudice that we do, and why the white race doesn't understand us. But he's also understanding that the white race can look deeper into who we are as a people, as a whole, as a community. And so Vine de Laura,